there, it's Jo from Minerva. Today I'm going to do a sew along of the Tilly and the Buttons pattern Stevie. Stevie is an easy to wear summer dress, but you could try changing different fabrics to wear it for different seasons. It's a beginner pattern. There are no tricky fastenings or closures, no zips. There's not tricky fitting. It's got some really nice features on the back that are really easy to do. Today I'm using a Minerva Exclusive fabric, which is a challis, so you'll get a slightly different look to the Stevie. If you use a cotton poplin or a baby cord, you'll get a different sleeve and a different fit, but with a challis you'll get a nice floating sleeve and a floating hemline. You always need to pre-wash challis because there's a little bit of shrinkage, so pre-wash your fabric and fold your fabric so that the selvages are matching and you have a fold edge ready for your cut-on fold pieces. If you're new to sewing, it's a good idea to block fuse your interfaced pieces for the neckline because it's really difficult to cut out slippy and wobbly challis and then try and cut out interfacing the same and hope that they match up. So in the cutting part of the video, you'll see a method called block fusing. So first of all, let's cut out. First, we're going to stay stitch the neckline. If you're new to sewing, that is a method for stopping the neck stretching out because you've cut the neck across the grain of the fabric so the weave can open out and then your neck facings won't fit onto your neckline. So first of all, sew a single line of stay stitching around the neck. If you're making the optional pocket, now is the time to fold in all of the seam allowances so that you get a perfectly square pocket. Okay, this is the pocket from the wrong side, so I have folded in a 15mm seam allowance on the sides, a little bit more on the top just because it's a floppy fabric, so I've just given that a slightly bigger seam allowance, and I've tacked it down. So you can see there I've got a tacking stitch running around and I've pressed it so that when I attach it to the top then it's not moving around too much. Look for those pocket markings that you made when you've cut out so that you can place the pocket in the correct place. There are markings for the pocket placement, so you line up the top pocket. I happen to have a little bit of pattern matching here, but it's not crucial. pin in place and sew around the edge. Now you might need to tack it again if you want to make sure that it's not going to wobble and move around. Next, we're going to join the back yoke pieces to the shoulder seams of the front piece. The back yoke goes right sides together with the dress front. So this is the front, this is the yoke. Pin the ends together and then pin through out that seam along here, and then you need to sew that with a 1.5 seam allowance. Throughout your making, any garment making, it's good idea to press your seams as you go along. If you've got nice flat seams, it means your facing will fit really nice and flush. You can overlock the edges, you can zigzag the edges, you can cut the edges with pinking shears, you can fold it over once and do a straight stitch machine line. Whichever method you use, you need to continue that throughout. It's time to make the neck straps. So there's two choices. So you can either have a button loop on the back of your two yoke pieces at the back, or you can have a tie which makes a nice little bow hanging. It's really good in challis because it hangs really nicely. If you have a thicker fabric, you get a bit of a sort of stiff bow, so maybe a button closure is a better option there. The neckties are pretty simple. You're going to sew across the end and sew down the long edge. Going to snip the corners so you don't get a bulky end. Take a little bit of the seam allowance out as well if you like, just like that. And we're going to turn that inside out. This is a tube turning set, and it's a way of turning out straps and tubes and neckties and belts, and you push the tube down inside the tunnel that you've made, and then you use the stick to push the fabric back out through the other end. And because it's a really nice smooth plastic, then the fabric slides along really nicely. You can use the end of the little stick just to poke out the corners. Be gentle because you don't want to burst the fabric at the end. And then you can press the straps, and you need to make two. All pressed, they're nice and thin, and they drape really nicely in this fabric. It's time to find the placement on the pattern, which is marked with some notches. Your placement for these is on the back neck. So here's the neck hole, and there are two notches next to each other, and that marks where you put the unsewn end of the tie. Pin that in place and repeat for the other side. It's quite good if you have the seam running along the bottom, but not crucial. You're going to tack those in place, so 1 centimetre in, sew them on the machine. Don't go past 1 centimetre because you want it to be within the seam allowance. If you're making the button closure, then on the left back you need to put a little loop. You can use a hair tie elastic band, you can make a little fabric loop, or you can put a ribbon loop on. You can also do a hand stitch loop, so whichever method you would like. Make sure your loop is pointing in towards the top, not sticking out. We're going to put the facing unit together. That's the front neck facing and the two back neck facings. Make sure you've got all the notches on there because that will be important for matching up the back opening for your dress. So the shoulder seams of the facing unit using a 1.5 seam allowance. Finish the edges of your facing and press the seams open because remember we want that nice flat seam to attach to the next flat seam, and attach the facing right sides together to the neckline, match the shoulder seams around the back neck, and keep the tie nice and flat so that it stays untwisted. Match all the notches and pin the facing in place. Apply the facing to the whole of the neck area, so that will be round the front neck and down the back openings. There's a tailor's tack marking a pivot, and that pivot point is important because then it means that the back pieces at the back of your neck will line up. Okay, we need to do some fabric handling so that this neck will roll over, particularly because we've got quite a fluid fabric, so we don't want all these lumps and bumps to show through. So I'm going to take off some of these seam allowances to create less bulk on the shoulders. I'm going to take off the corners where we did the pivot, and I'm going to clip the curves around the neckline, but up to the stitching but not through. And these small scissors are fab. It's better than using the dressmaking scissors because you can really clip close to the seam line. Once the neck facing is attached, you then need to press all of the seam allowance, or that clipped bit that you made, up towards the facing, and then from the right side you're going to understitch on the facing. So you're going to sew through the facing and through all of those little flaps of fabric so that your stitch line is not on your top. You'll find that when you get towards the corner here, the back corner where your tie is, you won't be able to go all the way to the end, and you haven't made a mistake. You just understitch as far as you can without making a little nick or a pucker in your fabric. So you won't be able to go all the way. It'll just help to keep the facing rolled under. So you need to make sure the seam allowance is pointing towards the facing on top, so you should feel like quite a thick sandwich there, but just the top there, nothing under there. And you sew 3mm from the edge. The beautiful neckline is all in the press, so you need to press all of the neckline, and the understitching helps that because it helps the facing to roll over. And now we're going to pin the neck facing to the top, and we're going to make sure that there aren't any ripples or creases on the right side, because we're going to sew it from the wrong side, so we don't want to flip it over and then find that we've got some creases that appeared on the other side. So this is why the seam allowances, all being accurate, make sure that this shape fits exactly in the top. So we're going to put the pins vertical because that helps to reduce there being a crease. There's one just there. Just want to make sure that that's flat. And then we're going to sew this neckline from the wrong side. You can use your however you finish the edge. Here I'm just getting a little fold, I can feel it underneath. I just want to make sure that that's flat. So use your however you finish the edge as a bit of a guide. I've got overlocking, so I can sew within my overlock seam. If you've got a zigzag, you can sew inside the zigzag. That will hold all of that down. I'm going to take a top stitch around here. It's a good idea to check your bobbin at this point. Make sure you've got enough to get all the way around, because you don't want to break in the thread line because it will be showing from the right side. The Stevie has a really nice feature, which is that the facings are attached flat to the dress, so they're not just loose and can pop out, they're actually top stitched. So you need to make sure that you're getting a really good line and that you've got everything even, because you'll be able to see that top stitching from the front. You've done the tricky bits now, it's time to sew the side seam. Right, just going to check that the back openings are the same length, match up the tops, check the bottoms. Mine happen to be the same length. If you've just got a little discrepancy, now's the time just to trim that down a bit, because you're going to sew this bottom seam, so you don't want to make one length longer or shorter than another. This is the back, right sides up. I've marked the centre point of that back yoke, so now I can put the yoke pieces right sides together, and I can put this centre back opening, look, there's the tie, on that centre line, and I can also do the same with the other half of the yoke, and I'm going to pin that in place so that the ends are matching, but really take the most bit of time here. This is the centre back, so make sure that those are right on the centre line. You can always just trim that out a little bit at the end. It doesn't quite fit, but it should all fit together. Then you're going to take a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance all the way along here. We're going to make the cuffs for the sleeve, so we're going to make sure that we've got an iron ready, because it's quite tricky to do this bit if you haven't got your iron out, so you need to make sure that you get all the folds in the right place. So across the end of the sleeves, make sure that's 1.5 seam allowance so that it fits inside the sleeve, and then fold the cuff in half and snip to the seam, so that when you fold this cuff in half, you can fold one seam allowance one way and one seam allowance the other way. Because if you have everything going to one side and the seam allowance from the dress, you'll have quite a lot of bulk, so try and spread the load by splitting the seam allowance in half. Fold the cuff in half and press to the wrong side. With those raw edges even, you're now going to sew the raw edges together with a 4mm stitch, 1 centimetre in the seam allowance. So this won't be showing, this is inside the seam allowance. Like this. With the dress right side out, I'm going to put a cuff inside the sleeve with all of the raw edges exposed now. So we've got the raw edges of the cuff and the raw edges of the sleeve. I'm going to match up the underarm seam and also the halfway notch on the cuff with the halfway mark on the arm. It's near the shoulder seam. It doesn't matter if it's not exactly on the shoulder seam, because there's not seams there to line up as such. You just need the cuff circumference to fit inside the arm circumference. Okay, we're going to stitch that in place and then trim and finish that seam allowance. It will all be hidden, so we just need to make sure that it doesn't fray. If you're sewing in a circle, it's easier to do it by sewing inside the circle so that your machine is going on the inside of the armhole, touching the cuff. If you do it the other way, you just run the risk of nicking or catching some of the other fabric from the dress. So just use your machine foot on the inside of the cuff. Okay, so the cuffs are attached. I'm now going to bring them from the inside to the outside, and I'm going to press that so that the seam allowance is coming up out of the way, and then I'm going to press it again. So on the edge I get the dress on the inside, the cuff on the outside, and for that to stay in place I just need to put a few stitches to secure it. So I'm going to do a little hand stitch under the arm, and I could put one on the top here, just discreet ones, and maybe one on the back arm, so that when your top is washed and you come to press it, you can press that cuff back into position. You can always just do a plain sleeve. If you're new to sewing and you're not sure about putting the cuffs on, you can just make sure that you take a really small seam allowance around the sleeve hem. You have a 1 centimetre seam allowance for the hem, but obviously try your garment on and turn it up as much as you need, and make sure that you again press your hem before you sew it. When you hem, the fabric always benefits from being pressed into place, so you've got a 1 centimetre seam allowance, and the fabric will sit really nicely under the machine then when you top stitch around. Kind of coarse hand stitch, especially if you've got a busy fabric like this, because you might not want to see black stitching running along these white parts, but it is quite a casual dress, so I'm going to go for a top stitch. Where the side seams come down to your hem, you can see there, look, when it's pressed it's sort of virtually making a hem for us. Inside there you can trim out some of the seam allowance, and that will stop the corners being chunky and bulky, especially on a fluid soft fabric like viscose, so you get a really nice flat side seam like this. Now it's time to sew. Your Stevie dress is finished, it's time to try it on. And here we are finished. So this is Stevie. Easy sleeve. Don't have to inset it or anything, it's just grown on from that side seam. The back's got the tie on this one, and in challis it looks superb because it just drapes really nicely. There's that top stitching that keeps all of that facing really flat, and it's sort of a feature of the neck there. You can see the top stitching coming across that colour there, but not in other places. You don't have to do the sleeve turn up. If you think that might be a step too far for you, you can just turn up the sleeves. The sleeves are quite easy to change at the cutting stage, so you can make the sleeves a little bit longer just to allow for self-hemming. It is quite a short dress, so if you don't like your dresses above the knee, then you can also add to the length. I'm going to be wearing this summer and winter, so I'm going to be wearing it with a cardigan or jacket in the winter with my tights and my red boots. And in the summer, I should be wearing it with my sandals. Stevie is a great pattern to choose if you've got a fabric with a really large print. So today my print was quite large, but if you had the challis in a larger print, so Herbal Halo's got a large print on it, the Celestial one with the moons on, that has got a large print on it. And because you don't have any darts or seams on the shoulders or anything sort of cutting into the pattern, the fabric pattern, then you can use a fabric with a really exciting print. I hope that's helped you maybe choose the Stevie pattern. It is a good beginner pattern and it's really versatile. You can also make it into a top, so that's really nice for wearing with jeans. So you can sort of get two garments out of one pattern there. We would love you to make a profile with us and share your Stevie dress if you make one over at minerva.com. Thank you very much for watching. See you again soon.